Hello, how are you? Let's talk about poetry a little bit before we actually start our readings. When approaching poetry, one might feel frightened, unsure, insecure of the fields we are about to enter. Or plainly, one may just not be interested at all and not approach poetry but end up reading a poem or end up reading a text that we could call a poem as I don't know, as reading a recipe or reading the instructions for setting up a piece of furniture. Probably, um, this is this is perhaps the most common approach to poetry for those people who end up reading poetry because they have to, and not because they enjoy reading poetry or because they want reading poetry, and that's okay. But the intention here is to, if that is the case, to try and work out a bit that perspective towards poetry and try to understand it differently. And the first thing I'd have to say is that when one is about to read poetry, when one is bound to read poetry, one should be warned. And why warned? Well, because reading poetry, many people think it's a tricky business. I don't think that. I don't think it is like that much. To be honest, I don't think it's a tricky business. Um, But one thing we have to bear in mind is that meanings in poetry can be encrypted, right? And that is probably one of the things that pushes most people away because they cannot understand straightforwardly what the poet is saying. Something which can sort of happen in prose, but not in poetry. Now, one of the things that you could say poetry does, or what one quality that we can highlight in poetry, is that it takes us somewhere else. It transports us beyond our here and now, our circumstances, and thus uh, then we might end up feeling blind in a situation in which we might feel blind due to our lack of knowledge um, beyond our here and now, as I said, and beyond the truths we take for granted, the realities we take for granted. And this is um, just getting to look at the world through someone else's eyes and getting to feel this other world through someone else's feelings, someone else's passions, and the passions proposed by the poet. And when I say passions, I, I refer um, like the senses, right? The feelings through which we interact with the world. Uh, this would place in poetry or through poetry. This would place the focus not so much on the physicality of reality, but also on the passions that build it, on that build this world and the meanings that derive from this. And I have to come back to this idea of passions because I don't want you to misunderstand me and just think that I'm only talking about romantic, from the literary perspective, view on the idea of passions. Let's think more of, I don't know, Aristotle, and says that the meaning, the first interaction we have with the world is through our senses. And through those senses, we feel the world, and passions grow through that, and therefore uh, meaning grows out of that interaction through the senses and create passions with which we create meaning in the world. And then this is a pathway into different reality, and that's somehow sometimes what make us feel like blind, if you like. But this is just going beyond our perspective. This is just about looking through someone else's eyes. This is about feelings and passions and how they help us make meaning. We could hardly argue against the idea that this world is built as much on feelings, senses, passions, as it is on the thesis that we tend to impose before uh, our idea of what is real. This probably is the result of modern thought. Uh, but passions, senses and feelings are the first means of interacting with the world. And this is a cultural thing. This is something that changes from person to person, but also from culture to culture, and therefore from language to language. Now, this means that our ideas of, I don't know, love, life, death, friendship, money, the city we live in, the occult, the world itself um, is different. It's different, as I said, from one person to the next. But people from the same culture, from the same language, will somehow share some general ideas about it. But if we change culture, if we change language, then these worldviews will change as well. And once we embrace and approach to reality from the perspective of the passions, our wondering about the world and its workings is enriched, widened, if you like, but certainly transformed into a more inclusive and more aware view of the world and its workings. And this is something we get through literature, and this is something we also get through poetry, being a literary expression, and in the sense that poetry will try to aim at all of our senses. And that's why I have to insist so much in senses, feelings, and passions, because it kind of triggers different kind of sensibilities, and those are gateways into, once again, culture. But we now talking about culture, we just have to bear in mind that poetry, as all literature, is uh, as much structure as it is culture. When we were reading Color, and he said that one of the features of literature was the integration of language. The examples he gave was about poetry, how sense and meaning come together, how sometimes the rhyming pattern within a poem implies a meaning that goes beyond the combination of words themselves. So um, that happens when we deal with poetry, but it's also structure, but it's also culture, and this is just to say that whenever we read one of Shakespeare's sonnets, and we will read a couple of them in this unit, or whenever we read a poem by a romantic, we will read, I think, three poems, or a modernist, or a postmodern poet, we deal with language and ideas that are believable, uh, feasible, understandable, adequate for the people for whom those texts were written, for whom those poems, for the cultures for whom those poems were written. And in such a way, we end up um, getting to understand, getting to know about those cultures, about the history of those cultures, and about the role of language within those cultures. And that's the idea to for this unit. I want to trigger. We cannot do a whole unit on poetry, but we are going to kind of trigger a bit. That's the whole idea, just to trigger that, just that approach towards this literary form. So I hope you enjoy reading what you have to read, and well, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.